Well, good afternoon, and welcome back to WOW and the South Bank, where the sun always shines on the righteous. I hope you're having a wonderful fifth WOW. Are you having a good weekend? I'm so glad. And thank you for coming to this Liberty event. I'm sorry that some of you are standing and some of you are sitting on the floor. I promise that next year I will be a Hollywood movie star and I'll get a bigger venue. Actually, I was joking. I can't produce that in a year, but 2 years' time. So this session today is about women's rights as human rights and about the ways in which we can use our Human Rights Act, currently so under threat by at least two national parties in the upcoming and deliciously exciting general election. And how that Human Rights Act is under threat, but we have some stories and experiences to share with you about how the Human Rights Act can be used and has been used as a positive force for women, who are, of course, some of the most vulnerable and abused people in this country. I have a fantastic panel. I want to introduce them briefly to allow them about 10 minutes each to share some thoughts with you, and then there should be plenty of time for questions and comments, and my favourite, which are, of course, comments thinly disguised as questions. And you'll know how to do that. You lift your voice at the end of the sentence as if you're French or Australian, and it works very well. But succinctly, so we get as many comments in as possible. So sitting immediately to my left, that's geographically, not necessarily politically. Who knows? Liberty is a cross-party, non-party organisation. It's a membership organisation, by the way. I need to remember to say that every few minutes. We have some leaflets out, and some of us are wearing a Join Us, Be Heard request, because we don't need fans and followers and Facebook friends and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need members for reasons that you'll hear. There is a lot of work to do. I'm about to remove my dignity. Purple, apparently, was the colour of dignity for the suffragettes. I learnt that this morning. Green, you think of as a colour of envy, but actually to the suffragettes it was hope. And white, don't laugh, is purity. So I've lost my dignity. We've still got the hope. And by the end of, goodness, it's warm. By the end of the session in the greenhouse, we may only have our purity left. Sitting to my left is Emma Norton, my dear friend and a great campaigning solicitor at Liberty, where she has led this strand of work with some considerable distinction. In particular, she leads on our military justice campaign. She represents, for example, the families of the deep cut victims, and she represents the family of Anne-Marie Element, who some of you may have heard about if you came to this event last year. She was serving in the Royal Military Police. She complained of rape, and that rape was allegedly investigated by her comrades, and investigation shut down very quickly. She was then subject to bullying, and she, not long afterwards, took her own life. And Emma has been able to use her great tenacity and compassion and legal skills and the Human Rights Act to reopen that investigation. To Emma's left, we have Helen Steel, who is, again, a campaigner of considerable distinction and experience. She was, I don't know if you remember this case, but she was one of the so-called McLibel 2, who was sued by a certain hamburger corporation for criticising their practices. But sadly, and this is hugely relevant to everything that's happening in this country with human rights at the moment and everything that's happened in recent years, she was in a relationship, or so she thought, an intimate relationship with someone that began in 1987, cohabiting in the 90s before he suddenly disappeared. And just a few years ago, she finds out, in some of the revelations of a few years ago, that this man, a.k.a. John Barker, was an undercover police officer with the Special Demonstration Squad. The Special Demonstration Squad. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right? Next time you hear the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary tell you that the innocent have nothing to fear from surveillance and intrusive undercover policing powers, please remember Helen, I'm sure you will. And then to my right, again geographically, and it's to the left as you see it, so it's fine. Harriet Wistrich, I'm very proud to say, was Liberty's Human Rights Lawyer of the Year in 2015, so just a few months ago. Yes, please. That's pretty much the highest accolade that we in our movement can give to a lawyer, and Harriet is a very worthy holder of that honour. She has been a human rights lawyer at Birnberg Peirce for some years, and she has led in the litigation against the Metropolitan Police in relation to the abuses of power by those undercover officers. I gave you a gist of that before. She also won a very important victory last year in the John Warboys case. You remember he was the London cab driver who was sexually assaulting vulnerable women in his cabs. And she was able to do that, again, using skill and tenacity and compassion and the Human Rights Act. So that is your panel. Please give them another welcome. Emma.
So I'm up. When the state fails to respond to allegations of rape or sexual abuse or domestic violence, it can have catastrophic consequences. The Human Rights Act is an essential tool for women and their families to get justice. In the last year or so, we've seen great strides being taken by women using the Human Rights Act to get justice for the kinds of abuses that disproportionately affect them just because they are women. Harriet's going to talk about some of her cases. Helen's here to give you some direct personal accounts. But just to review, in the last year, as Shami said, we've had the case of Corporal Anne-Marie Element. Her sisters used the Human Rights Act not only to get a fresh inquest, which uncovered the scale of the horror of what happened to that young woman and the appallingness with which women are treated, women in the army who have the audacity to complain that they've been raped. They've also used the Human Rights Act to get the rape investigation reopened, even though their sister is dead, which is really difficult and very unusual. And the only thing they were able to rely on was the Human Rights Act. Just last month, we've heard about the case of Joanna Michael, whose surviving family have been told that they can use the Human Rights Act to try and secure justice for her, for the police failings in that case. Joanna telephoned 999 one night to report that her violent ex-partner had just appeared at her home, bitten her ear, abducted her current partner, driven off in the car and said, "I'm going to come back and kill you." She called 999 straight away. The call was misdirected to the wrong police force. By the time it was redirected back to the right police force, the requirement that officers attend immediately had inexplicably been downgraded, so they didn't have to respond within an hour. And of course, by the time they arrived, they found Joanna stabbed to death in front of her children. None of these families would have had any hope, not only of securing justice, but of finding out what happened, which is one of the most important things, but for the Human Rights Act. Yet the current main party of government is pledged to repeal this particular piece of legislation, and public understanding of it, much of it misinformed by elements within the media, means that they might just get away with it. So if this happens, the one thing I would want you to leave the room knowing is that it will land a devastating blow to women's rights in this country. So what I wanted to do today, and you'll have to excuse me reading from my notes, because what I'm going to do is tell you a story, which is the story of one of my clients, and I'm going to call her Sarah. What's striking about Sarah's story is that the damage and trauma that she has suffered, that I'm about to explain to you, was not largely caused by the rape and the harassment that her ex-partner subjected her to, but it was rather caused by the behaviour of the police in whom she had placed her trust. She first approached me several months after the events I'm about to describe. She was a very successful professional person. She occupied a very senior and a very responsible position in a public institution. She had an impeccable, incredible career record. She explained to me that she'd been in a relationship with a man. They decided to move in together. He had very quickly become controlling and his behaviour unreasonable, so she decided to end the relationship. Because he had nowhere else to move immediately, she very kindly said he could stay in her house for a couple of weeks while he found somewhere else to live. One evening at home, over a period of several hours, Sarah consumed some white wine amounting to 3 units of wine. 3 units is about 2 glasses of wine. That fact, of course, should not be remotely relevant to anything, but you'll see that it was. She went to bed on her own, alone. She woke up in the middle of the night to find her ex-partner in bed on top of her, raping her. She froze, he finished, and as soon as he finished, she called the police. Officers from the local police force attended her, and they took her to the local SARC, which is the Sexual Assault Referral Centres. There she was treated well, and she was carefully examined. She provided a urine sample to test for drugs and alcohol, which is standard. She offered the view that she didn't also need to offer a blood sample, which is relevant for something that will happen later on. No concerns were expressed by either the police at the scene or the doctors that were treating her, the nurses, that she was under the influence of drug or alcohol. She went home, and the next morning, for reasons she ascribes to shock, she says that when she's under a state of extreme stress, she just goes into autopilot and carries on as normal. She got up and she went to work. And by middle of the afternoon, she said she was feeling absolutely atrocious, and so she came home. Meanwhile, the suspect is arrested, cautioned and questioned under caution at the police station. Predictably, he denied rape. He said that she had consented to sex. He added that she regularly consumed 2 to 3 bottles of wine a night. She was an unreliable drunk, and nobody ought to believe anything that she was saying. He also alleged that she was physically violent to him, and he had to call the police in the past. Needless to say, there was no evidence of any of this. If the police had just done a cursory check on their records, they would have immediately found that it was just total bollocks. Sorry. So, relaying this development to Sarah the next day, Sarah states that the police officer pressed and pressed and pressed her on whether her ex-partner might reasonably have believed that she would have wanted him to get into bed while she was asleep and have sex with her. That, of course, being the test for whether or not a rape is committed is whether the assailant reasonably believes that you've consented to sex. Exhausted from lack of sleep, she said anything was possible. She didn't know what was in his mind. Feeling overwhelmed by this point, and she says, sensing the lack of conviction on the part of the officer, who clearly did not want to investigate a rape allegation based on one person's word against another, she agreed not to proceed with it. An outcome of no further action was recorded on the police file, suspect release, case closed. From the above narrative, we now know that the following was in fact recorded on the police file about Sarah. I say facts, but facts in inverted commas. That she had consumed 3 glasses of wine, not 3 units, over the course of the evening. The officer appeared to find this particularly relevant. I'm not quite sure to what, but he's emphasised that. That she had refused to give a blood sample when asked to do so, which appears to have struck him as suspicious. No reference, of course, was made to the fact that she'd already given a urine sample, therefore a blood sample wasn't needed. That despite apparently having been up all night, this is a quote, having suffered this traumatic experience, the officer had learned she'd gone to work the next day. He was obviously very surprised about this, and there was a very sarcastic tone, in my view, to the note. And finally, and this is the clincher, because of her senior position at work, she was in a very responsible position, and she could make decisions that could affect other important people within that organisation. The information that the police now had indicated that she might be a risk to those other people, she might be a risk to herself, and therefore her employer ought to be told about what had happened. Finally, also the rape allegation was going to be no-crimed, and I'm going to come back just in a minute and tell you what that means, because I think that's something women really need to know about. Sarah wasn't consulted about any of this. She didn't know any of this was going to happen. So she went about the business of rebuilding her life. She recovered well, relatively speaking. She was able to carry on working, despite her concern that she'd felt under pressure to withdraw a rape allegation, and despite the fact that her partner, her ex-partner, was now harassing and assailing her with unwanted texts, posting pictures of her on the internet, all of that kind of rubbish. Some months after the rape, for the first and only time in her life, she was stopped for drink driving, but her blood alcohol was tested, it was below the legal limit, and she was let go. But that was another interface with the police. The following week, she gets a call to go and speak to her human resources manager at work. Human Resources Manager tells her that the police have now contacted them on 2 separate occasions, once back in when the first rape happened, and now again, so they wanted to talk to her about it. On the first occasion, the Human Resources Manager explained they'd been told that as a result of a police investigation, information had been received that Sarah had a problem relating to excessive alcohol consumption. Remember, the only source for this is the guy she's just accused of raping her. There's nothing else. On the second occasion, the manager informed her that she was aware Sarah had recently been stopped driving and her blood alcohol tested, and she was reminded of her obligations towards her employer, and the meeting was brought to an end. And Sarah says she just left that meeting in a state of complete shock. She just felt like she'd been punched in the face. But she was determined to find out what exactly the police had given her employer. She made a Data Protection Act request, which allowed her to ask for all information held about her by her employer, including the information that the police had given them. She learned that the police had given her employer, as Sarah put it, every graphic detail of the rape. The police had told her employer that she'd reported being raped, that the accused had said she was an alcoholic and ought not to be believed, that she'd then withdrawn the allegation the next day and it had been no crime, clearly raising issues about her credibility. The information also included the details of what she had described, including that she'd been woken up in the night, found him raping her, the horribly intimate details of the assault itself. They were all recorded on the file. The sceptical comments of the officer I've just described, and lots of background information about the suspect and their relationship. By this point, Sarah had decided to get legal advice, so she'd contacted us, and she was increasingly of the view by this point that her position at work was completely unsustainable, and she felt ashamed and humiliated, and she just wanted to get out of there. So she went on sick leave as soon as she heard of the disclosure, and a few months later, we negotiated her exit from that organisation. And so she has to leave this job at which she has excelled for many years, and she took a job somewhere else where nobody knew her at a much lower rate of pay. At the same time, she lodged a formal complaint against the police because of what they had done, which was eventually upheld, which means they agreed with her that they ought not to have disclosed, and they offered an apology. The staff involved were disciplined, but they were not sacked, and when Sarah asked how were they disciplined, she wasn't told that information. They wouldn't tell her. She was, however, assured, don't worry, there's been widespread organisational learning across the force, and everybody now, we are now satisfied, everybody knows how important it is to keep sensitive data private, and it's never going to happen again. Sarah was therefore devastated to learn some months later that a different police officer had got on the phone to her GP, who she had not disclosed for personal reasons that she'd been the victim of rape, and told the GP that she'd been a victim of rape. This triggered well-meaning but highly inappropriate phone calls from the GP surgery to Sarah. She had previously decided to seek specialist private expertise, recognising that GPs, and particularly her GP, wasn't sufficiently expert, and she didn't want it on her notes forever and ever that she'd been the victim of rape. So she was absolutely devastated by this. Once again, a complaint was lodged, and we were told that the officer had been given words of advice about it. And don't worry, he absolutely knows. He won't do it again. He understands what his legal obligations are, etc., etc. Imagine my surprise when some weeks after that, I was emailing the same officer about another matter, because by this point the rape prosecution was going ahead, and he was the officer in the case. And it was clear, I mentioned, basically I was saying to him, you shouldn't be at court with her because she'll find it upsetting that you're one of the ones that's disclosed this stuff. He clearly had no idea that he was one of the officers that had disclosed unlawfully information about her. He had no idea, and it was clear that he hadn't been spoken to. So just getting this wall of lies from the police. Sarah has now left her second job, and she's sold her house and she's moved abroad. In light of everything that has occurred, she's decided to leave her old life and move to be near her family. But hers is a really terrible example of the appalling treatment that can be meted out to victims of rape. Not only is she a victim of rape, she's a victim of the most appalling violations of her right to privacy. Her life has been irrevocably changed. As she puts it, this is a quote, "The consequences of reporting the rape to the police, for me, were far worse than the actual rape. The police betrayed me in the worst possible way. By reporting my assailant's false allegations and the sordid details of my rape to my employer, they destroyed my personal credibility and my professional reputation." So what next for Sarah? Well, I'm happy to say that she has pressed the police to reopen the rape investigation that's ongoing, and the harassment has resulted in a guilty verdict. So that side of things is now going okay. But I'm also glad to say that she's presently in the throes of suing the police for what they've done. And she's relying on Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, which is your right to privacy. So it's an article that gets a lot of bad press, but she's using that to get some sort of justice. And this process of suing the police is a really, really important thing for her, because she's feeling believed and she's feeling like she's holding the police to account, and rightly she's hoping to get some significant compensation, and why the hell not? So before I hand over, I said that I just wanted to talk to you briefly about no criming, because it sounds like a very dry thing, but it's actually really, really important. Sarah learned that her complaint of rape had been no crimed. In order to understand what it means, you need to know a little bit about how crimes are recorded. When you report a crime to the police, it's officially recorded as an alleged crime as long as the officer is satisfied that it's more likely than not the result of a criminal act. If it later turns out that the crime wasn't actually a crime, it can be no crimed. So, for example, police are called to a flat, there's a dead body, it looks like it's a suspicious death, they arrest the flatmate, but it later turns out the guy on the floor died of a stroke. So the original report of murder or arrest for murder is no crimed, so that it goes off the books. On paper, it makes perfect sense, because no criming can be a really good way of measuring experienced crime in a particular area, and it's a good way of monitoring how good the police are at solving reported crimes. And when it's done properly, it can also ensure that unfounded allegations may not later be disclosed about people. So on paper, it makes a lot of sense. But what's really clear is that simply because a case isn't prosecuted doesn't mean that it ought to be no crimed. Home Office guidance is very clear about this, and it makes clear that a reported crime must only be no crimed where new, verifiable information is now available, which shows that a crime hadn't actually taken place in the first place. As you can probably imagine, in the context of rape, no criming is particularly controversial. The Office of National Statistics last year estimated over a 3-year period there would have been in the UK between 60,000 and 95,000 victims of rape, leading to just 1,070 convictions. Might be worth reading that again. Over 3 years, between 60,000 and 95,000 victims of rape, leading to just 1,070 convictions. The obvious reason being most people don't report rape in the first place. But for those women that do report rape, many withdraw the allegation because they cannot face the prospect of a trial, or because they feel pressurised into withdrawing it, just like Sarah did, or because they're vulnerable in some other way, because they've got a mental health problem or a mental disability, or because they were vulnerable through drink or drugs and they just can't face the prospect of being completely eviscerated in court. But what is clear is that a woman deciding not to proceed with a rape allegation does not equal positive evidence that a rape did not occur in the first place. And the guidance is very clear about that. But what you can see is that the police aren't recognising that, and they're not following their own guidance. So listen to these statistics. In 2011 to 12, in Kent, 30% of reported rapes were later no crimed. So what that means is, according to the Kent Constabulary, 1 in 3 women who came and initially reported rape, in actual fact, there was then positive evidence to suggest that those offences hadn't actually occurred, which in my view is likely to be absolute rubbish. What it's saying is those women have falsely reported rape. So that's 30% of no crimes in Kent. In Gloucestershire, it was 2.4%. So there's this extraordinary regional variation which can't possibly be borne out by the facts, in my view. And make no mistake what this is about. Of course it's about performance statistics, because obviously the fewer crimes that are originally recorded, the better it looks for the police. But fundamentally, I think it's about a culture of scepticism that surrounds women and rape. And the priority is to protect men, innocent men, from false allegations, and not to address the appalling statistics which suggest that there is an epidemic of rape and sexual violence which is going unaddressed. So in summary, if the Human Rights Act is appealed, what hope is there possibly for women like Sarah, or for women in the Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre that Harry is going to talk about, who are already likely to have been the victims of sexual violence, or victims of domestic violence whose families have been able to use the Human Rights Act to find out what happened, or the victims of human trafficking, the vast majority of whom are women who are routinely failed by the Home Office and the police. The list goes on. Women suffer certain kinds of the worst offences precisely because they are women. They're entitled to expect help and protection from the state. And when that fails, as these short stories will show, the Human Rights Act is one of the main tools, it's the main tool that they can use to bring perpetrators to justice, to expose state failure, and hopefully improve things for other women. Yet it is precisely this fantastic piece of legislation which is currently under threat of serious repeal.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Harriet.
Thank you. That was very interesting, the story, you tell Sarah's story, as it's so many themes in so many other cases I looked at, and also in the War Boys case, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. There's a number of themes actually picked up. I'll try and come back to those particular things about the immunity and negligence that the police have, about blaming victims, about criminalising victims, and the no criming, and actually that the experience that sometimes the treatment by the state is actually worse than the original violation. Such as so bad have we got it wrong sometimes. All those themes come up again and again, and I'll try and come back to those. I just thought I'd start mentioning at the start two big news stories that we've had this week, which are very pertinent, and probably a lot of you have followed those in the news. One is the screening of the film India's Daughter, about the awful gang rape in India and the issues that arise in that. And the other is the story about the immigration detention, which has had some very, very good coverage last week, and an all-party parliamentary report about immigration detention, which is a scandalous thing, in particularly affecting women in Yarlswood, has been focused on. And I've done some work around, quite a bit of work around that, so I'll also just briefly mention some issues that come up in that, and again how important the Human Rights Act is in helping us get some accountability in those areas where the law often has failed in other ways. Just in relation, I don't know how many people have seen the documentary or read about it. Not very many, but I won't go into any great detail. But basically, and it's an awful story of a young medical student who was just finished her exams and was travelling home, and on a bus with a boy, a male friend, and she was viciously gang raped by a group of men on this bus and murdered, basically, thrown out and killed and left for dead, and died a few days later. And it had some incredible interviews with some of the rapists and also the rapist lawyers, which is perhaps the most shocking thing about it, because basically the rapist that's been convicted now was basically saying, well, women deserve to, if women go out at night, then they deserve it. And the lawyers were essentially saying the same thing. That one of them actually said, if my daughter did that, I'd throw her on a fire or something. And you just kind of think, my God, this is horrifying. But you have a kind of disjuncture here going on in between women who are trying to move forward and the young woman who came from a poor background who trying to move forward in society and qualify as a doctor, and then the punishment and the entrenched attitudes that still remain. And there's been a discussion: is this, are we just showing India as a backward country somehow? But actually, when you look at what's going on in this country, we're not so far apart. And an example, for example, is the Oxford grooming case, the recent report that's come out about all the young women there, like the Rochdale and the Rotherham and so on. And I saw that there's been a report, and criticising that report were the lawyers defending the men who were convicted eventually, and they in the course of their defence basically said, well, there's this is like a police manufactured case, and the complainants have been brainwashed by the social workers. It's better to be a victim than a slag. And that's what one of the lawyers said, and the other said, well, perhaps why they've come forward because they enjoy all the attention. And that's our lawyers, okay? The police, the attitudes that Emma described in that case, and what we see again and again when we take on these cases against the police is often police officers and also Crown Prosecution Service, who are in my at the moment are worse than the police in my experience. Attitudes that some officials that you get there, attitudes within all sorts of officials, and we still have this real disjuncture between, on the one hand, we're moving forward for women. Women are realising that they're not responsible for getting themselves raped, and that every woman has a right to live free from violence and all those things. And on the other hand, attitudes are so deeply entrenched. They're entrenched in the public officials, and they're entrenched in perpetrators, and we take those feelings ourselves and blame ourselves, and that's often why criminal convictions can collapse, because women are kind of frightened to admit to what their own complicity, which is nothing. It's just them just acting normally, but because they feel criticised and blamed. Just very briefly, the War Boys case was a taxi driver between 2003 and 2008. He drove a black cab, which is slightly relevant because the police thought that black cabbies would never risk their licence, and therefore, these accounts that were coming forward couldn't have been true. He drove a black cab, and he basically enjoyed the night run, where you would go down the West End and look out for drunk girls on their own and pick them up to drive them home. And then he sort of developed this whole modus operandi about how he would pretend that he'd just won some money on the lottery, and would they share a drink with him, and then he'd have spiked the drink. And then on the way home, he'd pull up somewhere and essentially sexually assault or rape these women, and then drop them off. And they would wake up in the morning and knew something had happened to them, but didn't know what it was. They couldn't remember because they'd been spiked. Now, I ended up acting for two women who were among, as it turned out, when we kind of eventually looked at the whole statistics, about during the course of this 5-year spree, about 10 women came forward to the police at different points to report that they believed they'd been raped or sexually assaulted. And in the two cases that I took on, the women basically made complaints afterwards about the way the police had treated them, because although the police guidance, and this is thanks to the work of feminists, says you must start from the position that you believe the woman, you must treat her allegation as true until it becomes evident that it isn't. That was not the approach that they followed, and they did not follow their own policy at all. And so these women were. They initially investigated it, but then they dropped the cases because they thought, well, why that's not credible. Black taxi driver never done that. They can't remember what happened. That can't have happened. And the no criming that you mentioned in the second case, which was quite critically. In this case, the taxi driver was actually discovered and on CCTV dropping her off at her university. And he was arrested, but the officers were so embarrassed when they interviewed him that it was, because they just thought this is ridiculous. That when you read the transcript of the police interview, it's a shocker really. Afterwards, they took the crime off the statistic. They called it a crime-related incident, again because the police station at hand had a policy to reduce their statistics, so they had better crime figures. That had huge consequences because it meant that it was not on the intelligence system. So if you've got a serial rapist going around, a key thing, and this was a finding in our case, is that you look at the patterns, and then a police officer says, "Oh, have you got any other cases where anyone's complained about a black cab driver, raping them?" And if they'd had those all up on their statistics, they the next time it was reported, they could have gone straight, just seen the patterns, and eventually that did happen. I think eventually some officer happened to come up with it again in the same case, and they put two and two together. So in the case that we brought, which was called DSD and NBV against the Commissioner of Police for the Metropolis, we brought the case on the basis of Article 3 of the Human Rights, European Convention of Human Rights, which is under the Human Rights Act. Reason we did that is because the police...
And Article 3 is...
the
right not to be subject to inhuman or degrading treatment or torture.
Yes. So it's an absolute right, it's a way we found to get round what exists at the moment and still exists after the Michael case that was referred to, which is that the police are immune from being sued in negligence. So the police are still, in that case, the court held, this is the Supreme Court held, that there is still an immunity in suit from negligence. So you can't sue the police if they fail to investigate, except now, through Article 3 and through the War Boys case, DSD, there is a way in which you can sue under the Human Rights Act. There is a duty to investigate, and this is, again, what Emma was saying, investigatory process is very important under the Human Rights Act. There is a duty to investigate all credible allegations of inhumane and degrading treatment. And what we were able to establish is that duty was breached in these cases, and the police, therefore, there was a declaration that these women's human rights had been violated, and a payment of compensation, which is now being appealed by the police, incidentally. But that's a very important judgment, which we hope we can build on, and which we hope isn't overturned. I'm probably overrunning a bit, am I? Or
Final thought?
yeah. I won't go into the detail. But if anyone wants to ask about the Yarlswood cases, this is another area. I would only say in relation to that one, I brought a number of cases of women who've been sexually abused by officers in Yarlswood, and one of the cases, the investigation resulted in accepting that this woman had sex with 3 different officers at Yarlswood. However, the Crown Prosecution Service decided that there was no criminal conduct in relation to that, which is extraordinary. We're trying to challenge that, but the state is still failing to hold to account, and while it continues to fail to hold to account, as we'll hear in a minute from Helen, in relation to officers who have. Who go undercover and have sexual and intimate relationships, then we're still very, very far away from enforcing the rights of women who are victims of male violence. So I'll stop there, but there's obviously lots of themes we could pick up.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to hear from Helen, and then there'll be time for discussion.
So Harriet's my solicitor. I'm one of a number of women who are taking legal action against the police after discovering that our former partners were undercover policemen who were infiltrating movements for social justice and environmental sustainability. And I personally was in a 2-year relationship with an undercover policeman who I knew as John Barker, whose real name was John Dines. I've been active in environmental and social justice movements since the early 80s. And in 1987, I got involved with a group called London Greenpeace, which campaigned on similar issues and became more widely known for the anti-McDonald's campaign that led to the long-running legal battle that I was involved with. I met John at meetings of London Greenpeace, and over the next 3 years we became close friends, and then started up a relationship. Over the course of that time, he told me about his dad's death. He told me that he had no brothers and sisters and felt alone in the world. He told me that all his possessions had been stolen from a van when he was living actually just down on the South Bank down there. And then eventually he told me that his mum had died and he needed to borrow money to go to her funeral in New Zealand. And all of these things weren't true, but what they were a very clever combination of kind of stories seeking to engender my empathy for him and draw me closer to him, and also to provide a reason for why he had no kind of history or anyone around him. So you know, I never met any of his friends or family or saw anything from his past. So in reality, what I've found out since is that that all these things were untrue, and you know, basically I was being used, as were other women, so that these officers could successfully infiltrate protest movements. But at the time I didn't know any of that. You know, I just felt I'd met my soulmate. You know, we seemed to click on so many levels. We moved in together. We talked about spending the rest of our lives together. We talked about having children. He said that, you know, he'd been an only child, and so he, you know, he would like a lot of children. Just really talking about, you know, I don't know, it was just like any normal relationship, really, whatever a normal relationship is. But and then towards the end of the relationship, the last sort of 6 months, his behaviour became quite erratic, and he seemed to be going through some sort of a breakdown, and he would take himself off and disappear. And when he came back, he'd said that he'd gone because he needed to sort his head out because he just felt alone in the world. I became quite worried about his mental well-being. So when he actually disappeared for good, I was actually very, very fearful about what might have happened to him, whether he was alive or dead. You know, I received 2 letters from him postmarked from South Africa saying that he'd run away because he couldn't handle things anymore, and talking about all sorts of things from his past, and saying he was abused as a child and all this kind of stuff, and most of which I've had, through having carried out a lot of research, I've discovered is also false. So, you know, there was a huge amount of emotional manipulation going on because I was really, really worried about his well-being. So anyway, because of what was in the letters and the way he'd behaved, I spent a huge amount of time trying to find him. You know, I was still in love with him, and I couldn't make sense of what was going on. And gradually over time, everything that I investigated kind of turned to dust. And, you know, I thought if I found his parents' death certificates, that I could maybe find out where he was from and find, you know, make contact with him that way. But there was no record of his parents' deaths. And just things like that. Everything I investigated, it just threw up more questions than answers. And then I got embroiled in the McLibel case and had to focus on that for several years. But one day on the way home from court, I had this sudden instinct to go into the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, which was on the same street as the Royal Courts of Justice at the time. And when I went in there, what I discovered was that he had been using the identity of a child who died when they were 8 years old. And really at that point, my whole world really fell apart, because here was this person who I thought I knew, who I'd lived with and who I'd really been in love with, and who'd seemed to love me, and now I didn't even know what his name was. You know, I didn't know anything about him. And if if you cannot realise what's going on in front of you with someone you feel so close to, how can anything around you seem real anymore? How do I know that the next person isn't somebody completely different? So it was, it was really hard to deal with. And the other side of it was, I was trying to make sense of why he might have been in my life. And one of the things through McLibel was that we'd found out that there were private investigators hired by McDonald's to infiltrate London Greenpeace as part of their investigations. So that was one of the possibilities I considered, that maybe he'd been one of those. But I also considered that maybe he'd been a policeman, but I considered that he could have been somebody who'd got into trouble with the police and, was hiding his identity for that reason. So there were all these kind of like possibilities. And I actually talked I did talk to a few trusted friends about, what on earth was going on. And when I spoke about the possibility that he might have been a policeman, people were just like, no way, that wouldn't happen in this country. You're starting to lose the plot. And then I started doubting my own sanity. I'm like, well, none of this makes any sense. So anyway, what I found out since is that this isn't just what happened to me. This has happened to a number of women. John disappeared in 1992, and I finally had confirmation that he was an undercover policeman in 2011. So I'd spent nearly 19 years searching for the truth. And in that time, the police had been actively trying to prevent me from finding out the truth. I'd actually gone to New Zealand, which is where he'd said he was from originally, found out some information there, and when basically after that, the police moved him from New Zealand to another country. The specific case that I'm involved with, there are eight women who had relationships with 5 different undercover policemen over a period spanning 25 years. So it's absolutely clear that these are not, individual rogue officers. This is like an institutional tactic. And the initial response when we exposed this was for politicians and the police to sort of say, well, what's all the fuss about? Men lie all the time. They often lie about their age or their profession or whatever. What's the difference? Now, firstly, I don't think most people think it is acceptable to lie about those kind of things anyway. But even if you hold that it is, this is something really quite different. This is like an entirely false person.
Sponsored by the state, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sponsored by the state, and everything about them is false. They've got a false name, they've got a false age, they've got false political beliefs, they've got a false job. There's just nothing real about them. And then to cap it all, they're there to spy on you and your friends and to undermine the political movements that you feel are important. And I think that this highlights the length that the state is prepared to go to prevent change, but it also highlights the sexist mindset within the police that thought it was acceptable to use women in this way to shore up the fake identities of undercover police officers. There's nothing in law that says that if a police officer suspects you of involvement in a crime, let alone involvement in a political movement, that they're entitled to sleep with you in order to find out. If the police want to search your house, they have to apply to the courts for a search warrant, and they have to, give some kind of a justification for that. With this, these guys were moving into our houses for as long as 5 years, living with us on a day-to-day basis. They had access to everything in our homes. They had access to our innermost thoughts because we thought that they were our trusted partners. And we're now left with this sense of, we have no idea about what of our innermost thoughts is now on special branch files somewhere. So we're fighting this case really to stop it happening to anybody else again. The particular unit that the officer that I had a relationship with in was the Special Demonstration Squad, which was formed in 1968 at a time when there was growing social movements for equality for women and black people. There was a massive movement against the Vietnam War, and those in power were starting to fear that they might lose the privileges and privileged positions that they've got. You know, I think we really need to. Sorry, how much longer?
I'd like to go to questions.
Okay, all right. So I think I've lost where I was now because I'm trying to cut it down. I've completely lost it.
Can I ask you a question, Helen, before we go to everybody for comments and questions? And I think you've alluded to the answer already. The police need a magistrate's warrant normally to search someone's house. They need a warrant from a politician if they want to tap their telephone, though I would prefer it if that was a judge as well. They need nothing by way of external authorisation to put an undercover police officer in your home and in your movement and in your bed, it would seem. They have not conceded that should change, have they? There's nobody in the police that concedes that it's time that undercover policing should be regulated by law, and they won't even accept that that they've behaved criminally in having these intimate relations. They've not conceded any of that, have they?
Well, what the police have done so far is basically try to cover up the whole thing by using this thing called neither confirm nor deny to refuse to answer any questions about what happened, refuse to acknowledge anything about it or provide us any information about why.
But they won't even say that it should be contrary to police practice to have intimate relationships with women.
Well, they've got a kind of dual line. On the one hand, they say it shouldn't happen, but actually when we put forward suggested wording to rule it out completely, when they were, is it the code of practice that they were changing?
They won't. I mean, they now say it should never be authorised, but they won't say it's it's a disciplinary or criminal offence. I just, if with 2 seconds, just to illustrate again, this is actually the CPS who considered one of the cases and whether the officer should be prosecuted, and this is again just an illustration of the kind of attitudes. The prosecutor basically said. Sorry, I'm just gonna lost it. But basically, I've lost it here. Undercover officers, if they're going to be, undercover
Effective.
for 5 years, they're bound to form intimate relationships and sexual relationships. We can't expect anything else. They have genuine. This officer, the CPS person, had genuine feelings. Sorry, paedophiles sometimes have genuine feelings, and this shouldn't be prosecuted.
So you see what we're up against, and I hope you just before we go to questions, just please give another appreciation to the Well, we have just a few minutes for questions, but I hope you'll appreciate why I didn't want to cut any of that important testimony short. And of course, Harriet and Emma are great and esteemed colleagues, but I think Helen's story is particularly special because she didn't choose to be abused in that way. So let's have a group of 3 questions, please. I think that's probably okay. So 1, 2, 3. Quickly as possible, please, with the microphones. Even pass them back if you can't. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Halla Gunnarsdóttir. I come from Iceland, and I just wanted to point out that these police officers were not only operating here, they were an export product of UK police authorities, and there were some of them operating in Iceland, surveilling the environmentalist movement there. At that time, when this was when this hit the news, I was working at the Home Department or Home Office of Iceland, where we did change regulations stating that police officers cannot, undercover police officers cannot have intimate relationships, whether sexual or emotional or whatever, with people. So this is not a very strong regulation, but it's still there.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And over there, please. Yeah, great. If we just pass that back. Thank you so much.
Hello. With the elections coming up, we've heard, and I've heard you speak before about how certain parties in particular, a vote for a certain party would be a huge threat to our Bill of Human Rights, which is obviously so important, as we've heard today. Who should we be voting for, and who I know, but who should we not be voting for? Because a vote for this party would mean a vote against our human rights.
Well, look, okay, we'll come to
that.
Okay, let's do the third question, then we'll do all of this. Hang on, no, forgive me, madam. I think it was over there, wasn't it? Oh, you changed it. Okay, then you're in. You're in. Sorry. No, I won't change.
Thank you. It's more of a legal question because I'm not from this country. So when I hear us talking about the human rights, I'm from Sweden, and you only use the human rights when it's pretty much atrocities.
No.
Why do we in the UK have to use the human rights when the country doesn't have legislation?
Thank you for your question. Okay, who wants to comment first on any of it? Okay, do you want to comment on any of that, or is it just me? Anybody want to?
So very quickly, I think in Germany also they have a law now in relation to it. It's quite possible to pass a law, and there's no good reason why there shouldn't be, and we should be asking politicians to do that. In terms of voting, all I would say is don't vote Conservative, because they are trying to repeal the Conservative.
Okay, so yes, at Liberty we have called for external warrantry signed by magistrates before there can be an undercover police officer. We have called for this, and we have failed at this point to persuade even the Labour Party to take up that amendment. And that is relevant to this point about the election. It's not. You can read the manifestos when they come out for yourselves. You don't need me to be unsubtle about this, and we're cross-party and non-party, etc. But I've even heard the Shadow Lord Chancellor saying that Labour won't put legal aid back, and I've even heard Labour opposition say nothing to hide, nothing to fear when it comes to undercover policing and blanket surveillance. So what I would urge you to do is A, join Liberty, B, read our briefings and sign up to our online petitions and so on, and also go to hustings in your individual constituencies and shame each and every one of the candidates if they're not prepared to answer to these specific allegations and these specific stories. We want commitments from them. We want them to protect the Human Rights Act. We want greater safeguards in relation to undercover policing, including sign-off by... Why should an undercover officer be anywhere for 5 years or 7 years? Right? There was no criminal prosecution in the offing. They were just doing intelligence gathering, right? This is when cops start playing spooks, and it's really dangerous, and it shouldn't be allowed. And you can all do this. This is the opportunity that you have as women in an election campaign where women's votes are going to be very, very important. And it's not as simple as this party or that party, though of course the Human Rights Act is an existential issue for me and for Liberty. It's also about applying pressure and getting these candidates to say things on the record at those hustings that can be called on after the event. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it just remains for me to thank all of you, to wish you a very happy International Women's Day, and to thank our speakers one more time.